The autumn wind rustled through the tree-lined paths of Dartmouth College, carrying with it the familiar scent of coffee from the campus cafe and the distant murmur of student conversations. For Karoline Leavitt, it was supposed to be a routine speaking engagement, another opportunity to share her conservative perspective with college students. But what happened that crisp October afternoon would transform not just her approach to political dialogue, but the lives of several young activists who thought they knew exactly what she stood for. The day had started like any other for the former Trump administration official. She'd arrived early, her leather briefcase containing carefully prepared notes about free market economics and constitutional rights. The campus coffee shop where she'd stopped for her morning Americano was quiet, just a handful of students hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by blue screen light. None of them seemed to recognize her, which wasn't unusual. At 25, she often blended in with the student body, despite her growing prominence in conservative media circles. What Karoline didn't know was that a group of student activists had been planning for weeks to confront her. They had their own stories, their own struggles, their own reasons for opposing everything they thought she represented. Among them was Sarah Chin, a junior whose parents had sacrificed everything to immigrate to America, and who felt that conservative policies threatened her family's dream. There was Marcus Rodriguez, whose student debt kept him awake at night, and Emily Thompson, whose sister's medical bills had bankrupted their family. The morning light filtered through the autumn leaves as Karoline made her way across campus, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestone paths. She passed groups of students heading to class, their backpacks heavy with textbooks and their conversations a mix of academic stress and weekend plans. The weight of her own college years wasn't far from her mind, the late-night study sessions, the passionate political debates, the moment she realized her conservative views made her a minority on campus. The lecture hall where she was scheduled to speak was still empty, save for a few event staff setting up microphones and checking the podium. Karoline took a moment to stand at the window, watching students cross the quad below. She remembered being in their shoes, feeling the pressure to conform to campus orthodoxy, the courage it took to speak up with a different perspective. Her fingers absently traced the edge of her briefcase, where inside lay not just her prepared remarks, but something more valuable, evidence of her own journey from college student to White House staffer. What she didn't see were the students gathering in the basement of the campus center, their handmade signs leaning against walls, their phones coordinating last-minute details of their planned protest. They had their own stories prepared, their own truths to share. They weren't just angry, they were hurt, worried, and desperate to be heard. In their minds, Karoline represented everything that threatened their futures, their families, their dreams of what America could be. The first hint that this wouldn't be an ordinary speaking engagement came when Karoline noticed the unusual number of campus security officers arriving. They spoke in hushed tones with the event organizers, their expressions concerned but professional. One of them approached her, asking if she wanted to consider using a side entrance. But Karoline had faced hostile crowds before. It came with the territory of being a young, female conservative voice in an increasingly divided America. "I'll use the front door," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to have a conversation, not to hide." The security officer nodded, respect flickering across his features. He'd seen plenty of speakers come through these halls, but something about Karoline's quiet confidence struck him. She wasn't here for confrontation, she was here for dialogue. As the lecture hall began to fill, the tension in the air was palpable. Students filed in, some with notebooks ready, others with barely concealed anger in their eyes. But what caught Karoline's attention were the three students in the front row, Sarah, Marcus, and Emily, though she didn't know their names yet. There was something different about them, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that set them apart from the typical protesters she encountered. The protest signs appeared suddenly, rising like a wave from the seats. "No hate on campus. Protect our dreams. America deserves better." The chants began, drowning out the introduction from the faculty moderator. But instead of retreating or calling for security, Karoline did something unexpected. She stepped away from the podium, removed her microphone, and walked to the edge of the stage. The protesters hadn't expected this. They'd prepared for defensiveness, for anger, for security guards rushing in. Instead, They faced a young woman who looked not much older than them, standing calmly at the stage's edge, waiting for a moment to speak. The chants began to falter, uncertainty creeping into their unified voice. What happened next would change the course of not just the afternoon, but the way these students, and thousands who would later watch the viral video, thought about political dialogue in America. Karoline reached into her briefcase, but she didn't pull out her prepared speech. Instead, she withdrew a worn leather journal, its pages marked with colored tabs and dog-eared corners. "I see your signs," she began, her voice clear even without the microphone. "I see your anger, your fear, your passion. And I want you to know, I was you not so long ago. This journal is from my sophomore year of college, when I was struggling to make ends meet, when I felt alone in my beliefs, when I wasn't sure if there was a place for my voice in the national conversation." The protesters hesitated, their signs wavering. This wasn't the script they had prepared for. Sarah Chen, in the front row, found herself lowering her sign slightly, her eyes fixed on the journal in Karoline's hands. Marcus and Emily exchanged glances, their carefully planned chants dying in their throats. "Today, I'm not here to lecture you," Karoline continued. "I'm here to share my story and, more importantly, to hear yours. Because the America I believe in, the America I worked for in the White House, is one where we don't silence each other. We listen. We challenge each other. We grow together." The atmosphere in the lecture hall shifted imperceptibly. The anger was still there, the disagreement still strong, but something else was emerging: curiosity. The students who had come ready for confrontation found themselves faced with something more challenging than a political opponent. They faced a peer who had walked similar paths, who understood their struggles, who wasn't dismissing their concerns but offering to engage with them. Stay tuned to see what happens next, as Karoline Leavitt transforms what could have been another angry campus confrontation into something none of the protesters expected. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about bridging America's divides through unexpected connections and authentic dialogue. The tension in the lecture hall hung thick as morning fog as Karoline opened her journal, her fingers tracing the worn edges of pages that held her own story of struggle and transformation. The protest signs were still raised, but the chants had died down to a whisper, then to silence. It was in this moment of uncertain quiet that Karoline did something that would later be described as either brilliant strategy or raw courage. She sat down on the edge of the stage, her feet dangling like a student ready to share stories with friends. "I see a sign there about student debt," she said, nodding toward Marcus, whose hands tightened around his poster. "My sophomore year, I had exactly $47 in my bank account. I was working 2 jobs, taking full credits, and still barely making ends meet." She flipped through her journal to a page marked with a faded yellow tab. "Here's where I kept track of every single expense: ramen noodles, used textbooks, the cheapest meal plan I could find." The authenticity in her voice caught the protesters off guard. Sarah Chen, whose sign about immigration reform was still half-raised, found herself leaning forward slightly. This wasn't the privileged conservative figure they'd expected to confront. This was someone who had walked through the same financial struggles they were facing. "But this isn't just about my story," Karoline continued, closing the journal and looking directly at the students. "I want to hear yours. Not your slogans, not your chants, your real stories. What brought you here today? What keeps you up at night? What future are you fighting for?" Her voice carried no judgment, no defensive edge, just genuine curiosity and an invitation to dialogue. For a moment, no one moved. The protesters had prepared for confrontation, for the familiar dance of shouting and being shouted down. They hadn't prepared for this invitation to be heard. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice slightly shaky but clear. "My parents both lost their jobs during COVID. I'm the first in my family to go to college, and every semester, I'm terrified I won't be able to afford the next one." Instead of launching into a defense of conservative economic policies, Karoline nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Tell me more about your family, Marcus. What do they do? What's their dream for you?" The personal nature of her questions transformed the atmosphere in the room. This wasn't a political debate anymore. It was becoming a conversation about real lives, real struggles, real dreams. Sarah Chin lowered her sign completely, her voice joining the dialogue. My parents run a small restaurant. They worked 16-hour days to put me through school, but with all the talk about immigration restrictions, they're scared. They're legal residents, but every new policy makes them feel less secure, less welcome. The other students in the hall watched in amazement as Karoline listened intently, taking in each story without interruption. She hadn't come to defend policies or win arguments, she had come to understand. The smartphone cameras that had been ready to capture conflict were now recording something far more powerful: genuine human connection across political divides. Emily Thompson, who had been clutching her sign about healthcare costs, found tears welling in her eyes as she shared her sister's story of medical bankruptcy. The whole hall fell silent as she described the choice between medication and food, the mounting bills, the feeling of helplessness. Karoline's response surprised everyone. Emily, I hear the pain in your voice, and I want you to know, we might disagree on solutions, but I don't disagree about the problem. Healthcare in America is broken. Let me share something with you from my time in the White House. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder of policy research, but instead of lecturing, she asked Emily what solutions she thought might work. The next hour transformed into something no one had expected. The lecture hall became a space for real dialogue about real issues. Students who had come ready to shout found themselves engaged in thoughtful discussions about economic policy, immigration reform, and healthcare solutions. Karoline shared her own policy perspectives not as absolute truths, but as potential approaches to complex problems. What made this exchange extraordinary wasn't just the civil dialogue. It was the way Karoline consistently turned the spotlight back on the students' experiences. When a young man shared his fears about climate change, she didn't dismiss his concerns but asked him to elaborate on specific impacts he was worried about. When a woman described her family's struggle with small business regulations, Karoline pulled out her phone and took notes. The protest signs lay forgotten on the floor as students began moving closer to the stage, forming an impromptu circle of discussion. The security officers, who had been tensely waiting for chaos, now stood back, watching in amazement as what was supposed to be a confrontation transformed into a masterclass in civil dialogue. But it wasn't just the students who were being transformed. Karoline herself was visibly moved by their stories, taking notes, asking follow-up questions, and occasionally sharing relevant experiences from her own journey from college student to White House staffer. She wasn't trying to convert anyone to her political views, she was demonstrating how to engage with different perspectives while maintaining both principles and compassion. The moment that captured the essence of this transformation came when Sarah Chin, still processing Karoline's unexpected approach, asked the question that had been burning in her mind: how can you work for policies that seem to hurt families like mine when you clearly care about people's struggles? Instead of becoming defensive, Karoline paused thoughtfully before responding. Sarah, that's exactly the kind of honest question we need more of. Let me share with you why I believe certain policies, though they might seem harsh in the short term, actually create more opportunities for families like yours in the long run. But first, tell me more about your family's specific challenges. The cameras that had been poised to capture conflict were now documenting something far more powerful: the moment when political opponents became human beings to each other, when slogans gave way to stories, when confrontation transformed into conversation. The students who had planned to corner Karoline found themselves cornered instead by her genuine interest in their lives and her willingness to engage with their concerns. As the scheduled time for the event began to run out, something remarkable happened. Students who had arrived as protesters began approaching Karoline one by one, not to argue, but to continue the conversations she had started. They exchanged contact information, made plans for follow-up discussions, and even began brainstorming ways to address some of the issues they had discussed. But this was just the beginning. What happened next would not only change the lives of these students but would also provide a blueprint for how to transform political confrontation into meaningful dialogue. Stay tuned to see how Karoline's unexpected approach rippled through the campus and beyond, creating a movement that would challenge the way Americans engage across political divides. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about breaking down barriers and building bridges in divided times. Have you ever had an encounter that changed your perspective on someone you disagreed with? Share your story in the comments below. What happened next would transform not just a single campus event, but spark a movement that would challenge the very nature of political discourse in America. As the scheduled time for the event came to a close, something unexpected occurred. The students who had arrived as protesters began forming a circle around Karoline, not to confront her, but to continue the conversations that had started. The atmosphere in the lecture hall had shifted from hostility to genuine curiosity. Marcus Rodriguez, who had earlier shared his story about student debt, approached Karoline with his phone in hand. Instead of trying to capture a gotcha moment, he opened his budget spreadsheet. "You mentioned you kept track of every expense in college," he said, his voice carrying a mix of vulnerability and hope. "Would you mind looking at this? I'm trying to figure out how to make it through next semester." Karoline didn't just glance at the numbers, she sat down with Marcus, pulling out her own college journal again. "Let me show you something," she said, flipping to a detailed budget page from her sophomore year. "Here's how I managed to cut costs without sacrificing my education." The other students gathered around, many of them facing similar financial struggles, as Karoline shared practical strategies she had used to navigate college expenses. Sarah Chin, still holding her immigration reform sign but now rolled up under her arm, stepped forward with a different kind of question. "You worked in the White House," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "Did you ever see the real impact of immigration policies on families like mine?" Instead of offering a political defense, Karoline shared a personal story that none of the students expected. "During my time in the White House," she began, "I made it a point to read every letter that came across my desk from families affected by immigration policies. I kept a folder of their stories." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a well-worn file. "These reminded me that behind every policy debate are real people, real families, real dreams. Sarah, would you be willing to share more about your family's journey?" The next hour extended well beyond the scheduled event time, but nobody moved to leave. Emily Thompson, who had been one of the most vocal protesters at the start, found herself engaged in a detailed discussion about healthcare reform. "But how can you support policies that seem to limit access to care?" she asked, her tone now curious rather than confrontational. Karoline's response demonstrated why she had become such an effective communicator. "Emily, let me share something I learned while working on healthcare policy," she said, pulling out her laptop. "These are actual numbers showing how different approaches to healthcare reform have played out in various states. But more importantly, I want to hear your ideas. What solutions do you think might work better?" The conversation expanded beyond just policy discussions. Students began sharing their personal stories of political awakening, their fears for the future, and their hopes for America. Karoline listened intently, occasionally sharing relevant experiences from her own journey from college student to White House staffer, but always keeping the focus on the students' perspectives. What made this exchange particularly powerful was how it began to spread beyond the lecture hall. Students who had been live streaming the expected confrontation continued their broadcasts, but now they were sharing something very different, a model of how political opponents could engage in meaningful dialogue. The comment sections of their streams, usually filled with partisan attacks, began to show a different kind of engagement. "Is anyone recording this?" one student asked, realizing the significance of what was unfolding. Several phones were already capturing the scene, but not for the reasons they had originally intended. Instead of documenting a confrontation, they were recording a masterclass in breaking down political barriers through genuine human connection. The security officers, who had been positioned around the room expecting trouble, now stood watching in amazement. One of them, a veteran of many campus protests, was overheard saying to his colleague, "In 20 years of campus security, I've never seen anything like this." The transformation in the room was palpable, from tension to engagement, from confrontation to conversation. As the impromptu discussion continued, something remarkable began to happen. Students started forming small groups, sharing their own experiences and perspectives, with Karoline moving between them, listening, asking questions, and facilitating connections. The lecture hall had transformed into a spontaneous forum for genuine political dialogue. One particularly moving moment came when a student who had been silently observing finally spoke up. "I've always felt afraid to share my conservative views on campus," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Watching this makes me feel like maybe there's hope for real dialogue." Sarah Chin, who had come to protest conservative policies, reached out and squeezed the student's hand in support. The impact of the event began to ripple across campus immediately. Students who had been watching from the sidelines started approaching their ideological opponents with different questions, seeking to understand rather than confront. The smartphone footage of the transformation started circulating on social media, offering a powerful alternative to the usual viral videos of political confrontation. What made this moment particularly significant was how it challenged the narrative about Generation Z and political engagement. These students, often characterized as being trapped in ideological bubbles, were demonstrating a remarkable capacity for nuanced dialogue and genuine curiosity about different perspectives. As the evening progressed, something unexpected happened. The students who had planned the protest began working with Karoline to organize a follow-up event. But this wouldn't be another lecture or protest. They envisioned a series of dialogue sessions where students from across the political spectrum could share their stories and explore solutions together. Marcus, who had started the day ready to protest, was now excitedly discussing plans for a student-led initiative to bridge political divides on campus. "What if we created a regular forum for these kinds of conversations?" he suggested, his earlier anger transformed into constructive energy. "Not debates, but real discussions about our experiences and ideas?" The transformation wasn't just in the students' approach to political dialogue, it was in their understanding of what real political engagement could look like. Karoline's strategy of leading with vulnerability and genuine curiosity had shown them a powerful alternative to the confrontational politics they were used to seeing on social media and cable news. Emily, still processing the unexpected turn of events, summed it up perfectly. "We came here thinking we knew exactly who you were and what you stood for. But you showed us that there's so much more to understanding each other than just our political labels." The scene in the lecture hall as the evening drew to a close was dramatically different from what anyone had expected. Instead of anger and division, there was a sense of possibility and connection. Students who had arrived as adversaries were leaving as dialogue partners, exchanging contact information and making plans for future conversations. But this was just the beginning. What would happen next would demonstrate the true power of transforming political confrontation into meaningful dialogue. Stay tuned to see how this unexpected evening sparked a movement that would challenge and change the way young Americans engage across political divides. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about breaking down barriers and building bridges in divided times. Have you ever had an experience that completely changed how you view someone from the other side? Share your story in the comments below. The impact of that evening in the Dartmouth Lecture Hall would extend far beyond campus boundaries, creating ripples that would transform political discourse across America's universities. But the most immediate and powerful change was visible in the days that followed, as the video of Karoline's unexpected approach began circulating on social media platforms. What caught people's attention wasn't just the dramatic shift from confrontation to conversation, it was the authentic moments of connection that had been captured on camera. The clip of Sarah Chin lowering her protest sign and sharing her family's immigration story went viral, not because it was controversial, but because it showed something rare in modern political discourse: genuine human connection across ideological lines. A week after the event, Marcus Rodriguez organized the first student-led dialogue session, inspired by his interaction with Karoline. The format was simple but powerful, students from across the political spectrum sharing their personal stories and the experiences that shaped their beliefs. The session that was planned for 30 students ended up attracting over 100, with more waiting outside the room. Emily Thompson, who had been so angry about healthcare policies, took on a leadership role that surprised even her. She started a podcast called Beyond the Divide, featuring conversations between students with opposing political views. Her first guest? The conservative student who had been afraid to share her views on campus. Their honest discussion about healthcare, family struggles, and finding common ground became required listening in several political science classes. But the most remarkable transformation was happening in the day-to-day interactions on campus. Students who had once avoided or confronted those with different political views were now engaging in genuine dialogue. The techniques Karoline had demonstrated, leading with curiosity, sharing personal stories, and looking for common ground, were being replicated in dining halls, study groups, and campus organizations. Sarah Chen's journey became particularly emblematic of the change. She organized a dinner series called Breaking Bread, Breaking Barriers, where students from different political backgrounds shared meals and stories. "We're not trying to change each other's minds," she explained to a local news reporter. "We're trying to understand each other's hearts." The video of the original event continued to spread, catching the attention of national media outlets. What made it particularly compelling was how it challenged the prevailing narrative about Generation Z and political engagement. Here were young people demonstrating that meaningful dialogue across political divides wasn't just possible, it was happening. Karoline's approach became a case study in effective political communication. Rather than defending policies or arguing points, she had created space for genuine human connection. Political science professors began incorporating the video into their curricula, using it to teach students about productive political discourse in a polarized age. 3 weeks after the event, something extraordinary happened. A group of students from a neighboring university, inspired by the viral video, reached out to the Dartmouth group. They wanted to learn how to replicate the dialogue model on their own campus. What started as a single confrontation-turned-conversation was becoming a movement. Marcus, who had once organized protests, found himself leading workshops on transformative dialogue. "The biggest thing I learned from Karoline," he told a group of students from another college, "was that behind every political position is a personal story. When we start with stories instead of arguments, everything changes." Emily's healthcare discussion group expanded to include medical students, policy experts, and people sharing their real experiences with the healthcare system. What had started as angry protests about policy had transformed into constructive discussions about solutions. "We still disagree on some things," Emily noted, "but now we're actually talking about how to fix problems instead of just shouting about them." The impact on campus culture was profound. The university's president noted in a campus-wide email that reported incidents of political harassment had dropped significantly. Students were still passionate about their beliefs, but they had found more productive ways to engage with those who disagreed. Sarah's immigration story became part of a larger narrative about finding common ground. She and several conservative students began working together on a proposal for immigration reform that addressed both humanitarian concerns and security issues. Their collaborative approach attracted attention from policymakers and media outlets interested in solutions rather than sound bites. The transformation wasn't limited to the students who had been present that evening. The video of Karoline's approach had resonated with young people across the country who were tired of political polarization. Campus organizations at dozens of universities began reaching out, asking how they could create similar dialogue programs. What made this movement particularly powerful was its organic, student-led nature. These weren't top-down initiatives from university administrators, they were grassroots efforts by young people who had seen a better way to engage across political differences. The students were creating spaces for genuine dialogue while maintaining their own political principles. Karoline herself was invited back to campus a month later, not for a lecture but to participate in one of the student-led dialogue sessions. The contrast with her first visit was striking. Instead of protest signs, she was greeted with students eager to share their stories and learn from each other. The lecture hall was arranged in a circle, symbolizing the new approach to political discourse. During this return visit, Karoline shared something she hadn't revealed during the first encounter. "What you students have created here," she said, "goes beyond anything I could have imagined. You've shown that the future of political discourse doesn't have to be about winning arguments, it can be about building understanding." The impact continued to grow. Other conservative speakers began adopting similar approaches, leading with personal stories and genuine curiosity rather than prepared talking points. Liberal student groups started inviting conservative speakers specifically for dialogue sessions rather than confrontational debates. The paradigm was shifting. 6 months after the original event, the students organized a conference called Bridging the Divide, that attracted participants from over 50 universities. The opening session featured videos of that first evening, showing how a potential confrontation had transformed into a movement for meaningful political dialogue. Marcus, Sarah, and Emily took the stage together at the conference, each sharing how their approach to political engagement had changed. "We thought we were going to corner Karoline that day," Marcus reflected, "but instead, she showed us a better way forward. She cornered us with kindness, with curiosity, with genuine interest in our stories." The legacy of that evening continues to influence how young people engage in political discourse. The students who were present have graduated and moved on, but the dialogue programs they created continue to thrive and evolve. New generations of students are learning that political engagement doesn't have to mean political confrontation. Perhaps the most powerful testament to the impact of this transformation came from an unexpected source. A year after the event, a national survey of college students found that universities with dialogue programs inspired by the Dartmouth model reported significantly higher levels of political engagement and significantly lower levels of political hostility. As we end this story, remember that real change often starts with a single moment of genuine connection. Karoline Leavitt didn't set out to create a movement that day. She simply chose to respond to confrontation with curiosity, to anger with understanding, to division with dialogue. In doing so, she and the students she engaged with provided a blueprint for transforming political discourse in America. If this story has inspired you, take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. We bring you these powerful stories of transformation and connection to show that change is possible even in our most divided times. Have you ever experienced a moment where genuine dialogue changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments below. Together, we can build bridges across the political divides that too often separate us.